Maraming salamat, Decano Encanto, sa magandang introduction na yon. Magandang hapon sa inyong lahat at malugod na pagbati sa Jubilee Class ng UP College of Mass Communication. Salamat sa mga estudyante at sa dekano at dating dekano, sa mga miyembro ng faculty ng UPCMC sa pag-imbita sa akin. Malaking karangalan para sa akin ang maging speaker sa 50th anniversary ng UP College of Mass Communication. Magandang taon ang 50, alam ko kasi naraanan ko na yun. At magandang panahon yon para magmuni-muni at tingnan ang nakaraan at tumingin din kung ano ang kinabukasan. Marami tayong matututunan sa nangyari nung nakalipas at marami rin mula dun sa ating natutunan, matatanaw din natin ano ba ang naghihintay sa atin sa kinabukasan. Alam niyo na ipinanganak ang UPCMC nung birthday ni Rizal noong 1965. Kakaiba ang College of Mass Communication o dating Institute of Mass Communication kasi ito lang ang kolehiyo na itinatag, kolehiyo ng journalism at masscom na itinatag bunga ng isang law na ipinasa ng Kongreso, RA 4379. May mga naunang kolehiyo gaya ng sa UST, pero isa lang ang itinatag ng Republika para itaguyod ang malayang pamamahayag. Itinanong ko, nag-research ako para sa speech na ito. So nag-interview ako kay Victorol, isang kaibigan ko at miyembro ng unang class noong 1965, kung ano ang natatandaan niya. Ang sabi niya, wala pang building ang UPCMC noon. Ang mga klase ay ginagawa dun sa 4th floor nung tinatawag na Palma Hall. Palma Hall pa rin ba ang tawag doon? Katabi ang masscom ng anthropology department at ng mga fossil exhibits doon sa 4th floor. Ewan ko kung may ibig sabihin yon. Ang diliman noon, madilim talaga. Wala pang mga mall, wala pang gaanong mga restaurant, kakaunti pa lang ang sasakyan dumadaan dito. Ang sabi ni Victorol sa akin, ang puntahan nila ay yung drugstore sa May Balara. Natatandaan mo ba yon, Dean Teodoro? Si Dean Encanto, natatandaan pa. May drugstore daw doon sa May Balara na may ilang mesa at jukebox. Doon sila pumupunta para kumain ng corned beef at fried egg. Hindi ko alam kung anong hangout ninyo ngayon, pero ang pinupuntahan nila noon, yung Butterfly Bar, dyan sa may pagpasok ng University Avenue, at ang pinaka-class na inumin noon, ang Butterfly Iced Tea. So marami ng kaibahan ngayon. Nakikinig sila noon sa Beatles. Ang pinapanood nila sa TV ay ang Nida Nestor Show, Buhay Artista, Pancho Loves Tita, Tawag ng Tanghalan, Hindi American Idol. Nung unang batch ng masscom ay journalism lang. Kasi galing ang journalism school o ang origins ng journalism ay mula sa English Department ng College of Arts and Sciences. Ang mga nagtuturo sa kanila noon, galing din sa English Department. Ang sabi ni Victorol noon, ang natatandaan niya, ang sinabi sa kanila ni NBM Gonzales, isang kilala niyo naman siguro si NBM Gonzales, kilalang manunulat, sabi daw niya, journalism is the laloma of literature. Alam niyo ba ang laloma? Hindi nila alam ang laloma. Paano ko ba i-explain ang laloma? Ang laloma, kung baga, mas grabe pa sa Quiapo, ano? Oo. Parang a poor cousin. Parang lower form of writing. Noong panahon na yon, ang mga nagtuturo kasi ay talagang batigang manunulat. Kasama na nga, at ang mga manunulat noon, maraming journalist noon, galing sa literatura, gaya ni Nick Joaquin, ni Greg Brillantes. Mahabang tradisyon ito mula pa ng panahon ni Jose Rizal at ni Marcelo del Pilar. Ang mga manunulat ay galing sa literature. Nagdadouble sila sa kumbaga, lumalangoy sila sa dalawang ilog, sa ilog ng literatura at ilog ng periodismo. Meron din dun sa unang klase, mga klase ng UP Masscom, meron din mga journalist gaya ni Armando Malay, ni Hernando Ebaya at ni I.P. Solyongo. Mga editor ito at kolumnista na nagbigay dun sa mga estudyante ng kung ano ba talaga ang journalism in the real world. Natatandaan ni Victor Roll na una niyang narinig yung attack and collect, defend and collect. Alam niyo ba kung anong ibig sabihin nun? Yes. Na tipo ng journalism kay Dean Malay, na noon ay editor sa Manila Times. Ang kwento daw ni Dean Malay sa kanila, may isang kolumnista noon na batigan na nakapagpatayo ng bahay sa Bel Air, hindi dahil sa sweldo niya bilang periodista, kundi dahil sa mga binibigay sa kanya ng mga congressman at iba pang politiko. Ang bahay daw niya ay tawag, the house that the house built. Ang mga reporter noon, gaya ng ibang reporter din ngayon, yung iba lang, mas malaki ang kinikita nila mula sa pabigay. Yung nga raw, isang reporter, ang gagawin niya, iiwan niya yung wallet niya na walang laman sa mga opisina ng mga congressman. Pagbalik niya, may laman na raw yung wallet. So, at that time, hanggang ngayon, maliit lang kinikita ng mga periodista. Ang natatandaan ni Victor Roll, ang unang sweldo niya bilang correspondent ng Philippine News Service ay 5 centavos per word. Kung inalabas yung story niya sa dyaryo, kasi news agency yung Philippine News Service, 10 centavos per word kapag nasa page 1. Ang sweldo niya bilang copy editor, nung naging copy editor siya ng Manila Times, 400 pesos a month. At that time, magandang salary na yon. Ang mga pahayagan noong araw na yon ay pag-aari ng mga malalaking businessman tulad ni na mga Lopez, mga Elizalde, mga Soriano. Exception doon yung mga Roses na may-ari ng Manila Times. Ang 1965, Philippines was one of the most prosperous countries in Southeast Asia. Leader ang Philippine Press sa Asia, sa pinaka-moderno at may pera at mayaman. Yun ang panahon na bumubulusong din ang Philippine business. 1967, itinayo ang Asian Institute of Management. So leading tayo sa pagtuturo ng mga periodista at pagtuturo ng mga mangangalakal. So nakita ninyo, maraming pareho pa din, di ba? Mula noon hanggang ngayon. Then, as now, young people are attracted to journalism for various reasons, both noble and not so noble. They want to be journalists because they want to have influence. They want to change society. Some become journalists because of the glamour. The journalistic life allows a ringside view of events, allows you access to the powerful. You mingle with people from all walks of life. It continues to be, it was then, and continues to be an exciting profession. It was also a glamorous profession. Ang tanda ni Victor Roll, the Manila Times then had its own plane called Newsboy. So they would go to their coverages in their own plane. For idealistic young people at that time, journalism was a way to influence what was going on in the world, to be part of the public conversation, to be a watchdog of society. Then, as now, journalism attracts a mix of idealists and opportunists. Some see the press as a defender of the public interest. Others see the media as a stepping stone to political power or to money and influence. You decide what kind of journalist you want to be. But I will tell you, with the hindsight of 50 years, the journalists who are remembered are the journalists who defend and promote the public interest. Walang nakakaalala dun sa mga journalists na tumatabi lang o tumatanggap lang ng pera. Except for a few, the other thing that has remained the same is that except for a few, you don't get rich from journalism, correct? Alam niyo ba yon? Do your parents know that? Now they know. Very few people make a lot of money from journalism. The other thing that has not changed is that the press is still subject to political patronage. There is, pag lumabas na kayo, when you go out there into the real world, you will see that there is a disconnect between the high standards you learn in the school, in this school and the real world out there. The other thing that hasn't changed is that the press remains, then as now, largely supportive of the status quo. There were some exceptions or some exceptional moments, such as the late 60s and early 70s during the opposition to Marcos, or in the mid 80s during the anti-Marcos movement. For the most part, while our media history glorifies revolutionary press or the propaganda movement of the late 19th century, in much of press history, the press was not a force for change. The press has largely been, or the media have largely been, a reflection of existing power structures. Then, as now, there was an information divide. In the 1960s, there were English language newspapers and magazines and television for the urban, educated class. The masses had radio and popular magazines, if any at all. Large parts of the country were still not reached by the media in the 1960s. So those are the things that have not changed. Even now, we have an information divide. You know, I have 2 devices, an iPad and an Android phone, and I access the news whenever I want from this. But you do, how many of you have accessed the news from your mobile phones? Mainly from your mobile phones, yes. But not everyone has a mobile phone. There was before an analog divide, today there's a digital divide. What has changed? That has changed. It's the twilight of newspapers. I know the Philippine Daily Inquirer is a big supporter of this school. Philippine Daily Inquirer now is mostly reached by people from the web or from the internet, not from the newspapers. I want to prove this assertion by asking the people in this class, how many of you have touched a paper newspaper in the past at least three times in the past week? Can you raise your hands higher? It's not a mark of shame. So small minority. All the rest of you, where do you get your news? Television, main source of news. TV? Internet? Facebook? Twitter? Yeah. So that has changed. When I was a young activist during the Marcos era, we produced a newspaper using not even a mimeographing machine, we used silkscreen. You know how paano gumawa ng t-shirt? Ganon. Iniisa-isa namin. Handmade newspapers. Times have changed. That is no longer the way to communicate whatever times of news. People access the news now from multiple devices. We've seen the newspapers were once the most powerful medium in the Philippines. They are no longer, as you know. Newspapers are no longer the agenda setter or the political kingmaker. It is largely television and increasingly the internet. This is part of a long-term change. Ang tawag nila dito, post-industrial journalism. In my day, it was pre-industrial because we used silkscreen. But now it's post-industrial. What does that mean? That means that the news is no longer tied to the means of production. That means you don't need radio or TV transmitters or printing presses in order to reach an audience. Anyone now can publish. Everyone is a journalist. Journalists no longer have a monopoly of news creation, news production, and news dissemination. News can break on Twitter, by non-journalists, by ordinary citizens, or on Facebook. People can be mobilized now, no longer through the media. 1986, it was radio that mobilized people in the People Power Revolution. That's no longer the case. People are now mobilized on Facebook or on Twitter. There's been a change in consumption patterns. Social and search are now the main ways to get the news in many countries around the world. Last week, I was at the Rappler office, and they told me that 80% of the readers access Rappler through mobile, not even through laptops or desktops. Last month, Reuters released a survey of 12 countries. 41% of readers in those countries get news through social media platforms, so nearly half. News is something that is shared. Nung panahon ni Victorol, sabi niya, nakatira siya sa Nara dormitory. May isa o dalawang dyaryo daw. Tapos pinagpapapasahan yung physical na dyaryo, bawat isa from room to room. The actual newspaper was passed from room to room. Now shareability means sharing the news on Facebook or Twitter. Our audiences now are also different. Our audiences are technologically savvy. They have multiple devices. They are more global in their outlook. They have traveled. They're more exposed to the world. They've traveled or they have relatives overseas. The platforms that they get into, YouTube and Google, are not bounded by geography. You can read any newspaper in the world, whether it's the New York Times in New York or Shaixin, which is an independent magazine in China, wherever you are. We're also finding new audiences, new communities being created for news, including LGBT, the audience, millennials, upwardly mobile professionals. There are now news sites and news organizations that have sprung mainly to address the needs of specific audiences. Hindi ito kakaiba nung panahon nung about 100 years ago. The founder of the school where I now teach, Joseph Pulitzer, was a Hungarian immigrant. He set up a newspaper in New York that was different from the New York Times. He reached out to an audience that the New York Times did not reach. These were mainly immigrants who did not know much English, who could barely read in English but were interested in the news. He did not write about the powerful. His newspaper wrote about ordinary people and their problems. Similarly, the new news organizations are reaching out to audiences previously unreached by the mainstream media and giving them news that they care about that's connected to them. The other thing now is that the internet has made news production more democratic, but the reality is that new ownership of media is more concentrated than ever before. Noong 1960s, may ilang pamilya lang na nagko-control sa mga dyaryo. Ngayon din ata, ganun pa rin. No? In fact, we see now cross-ownership of TV and newspapers. Worldwide, that remains the trend. The top 50 media companies in last year were overwhelmingly companies in the US and Europe. 2/3 of them were in the US. While the media ownership has been deregulated, the reality is it's much easier now to control news flow by controlling any of the big media platforms like Facebook or Twitter. Ang isa pang bago ngayon, journalism has become an even more dangerous profession, not just in the Philippines, but elsewhere in the world. More than 200 journalists are in prison, and half of them are online journalists. These are in prison in the world. Over 1,000 journalists have been murdered since 1992, 88% of them with impunity. Journalists from online media and small news organizations are the ones, or freelancers, worldwide, this is a trend, are the ones most vulnerable. Narinig niyo siguro yung pagpugot ng ulo noon kay James Foley ng ISIS. Dati, hindi tinatarget ang mga foreign correspondent o mga journalist kasi kailangan sila para ipalabas ang balita. Ngayon, pwede ka na maglabas ng sarili mong balita. Ano pa? So journalists, instead of being seen as channels for news, are being seen as high-value targets for terrorists, criminal organizations, etc. So journalism worldwide has become more dangerous. What does this mean for you and for journalism schools? I teach in a journalism school now. I was not a graduate of journalism. I studied political science. And people ask me, in an era when everybody, lahat ay pwede ng maging periodista, in an age when everybody is a journalist, what use is journalism or a mass communications degree? Do you need to study when everyone is able to disseminate and propagate the news using a mobile phone instantaneously to the world? I think there's still a need for journalism as profession and as discipline. Everybody can be a journalist, it's true. Everybody can tell a story, but not everybody can tell a story that is factual and true. Journalism is the discipline of verification. In the fast-paced world of the internet, mistakes are made, both by journalists and by citizens. But the things that you have learned in journalism or mass communication school tell you the skills of fact gathering, of verification, of corroboration of information, of getting the other side of the story are skills that citizen journalists do not have. Whatever type of media landscape we will have, there will still be a need. Whatever you call them, whether you call them journalists or not, there will still be a need for the professional verification of information. There will still be a demand for credible information in a world where news and where issues are becoming increasingly complex. There will still be a demand for journalistic skills. Journalism is about getting the facts and getting them right. If there is one thing you must remember from this talk, and I hope you will remember, it is that. And the discipline of getting those facts and verifying those facts is what distinguishes the real journalism from the pretend journalism. A few months ago, I was part of a team of my dean and I at the journalism school at Columbia. We did a study of how Rolling Stone magazine got wrong a report on gang rape in a university in the US. Have you heard of this? There was a report of a gang rape. It turns out that the report was most likely fictional and made up. What did we find from that investigation? We found that the journalists made a mistake because they relied solely on a single source. Lesson number one, never rely on a single source. Second lesson, they failed because they did not corroborate the facts of the story with other interviews and with documents and other sources of information. Third, they failed because they did not get the other side. They failed also because they let their sympathy. Journalists need to be empathetic and sympathetic, especially to those who have suffered abuse, harm, or been victims of wrongdoing. But their sympathies should never get in the way of the discipline of their craft. And the discipline is corroborating information. They erred because they let their biases, their prejudices, and their sympathies get in the way of their reporting. So there was here an error of method and an error in empathy unchecked by professional fact-checking. So that's the first thing you must learn, or I'm sure you have learned, but you must exercise when you go out to the world, and that journalism schools have the edge in doing. No other school in the university teaches this kind of checking on contemporary events. Only the journalism school does. Journalism schools can hold high their heads in the academy. Aren't we poor cousins in academia? Journalism schools are looked down upon because they don't produce enough PhDs, and they say journalism does not have the same type of rigor that the social sciences or the natural sciences have. That is wrong. Journalism, if practiced well, is a rigorous discipline. And this is a discipline that journalism schools can teach and that journalists can learn. Second thing you must learn is technological literacy. News gathering and dissemination are changing very fast. Facebook, for example, was founded in 2004, mainly by college kids, for college kids. Now it is a global platform. The market capitalization of Facebook is $200 billion. The market capitalization, that means what the company is valued at. The New York Times, guess what? Its market capitalization is $2.4 billion. Facebook has more than 1 billion users. The New York Times has 57 million unique visitors a month. So platforms, social platforms, are becoming more powerful and more ubiquitous than news platforms. This is something we should be concerned about. And the journalists of your new generation should be able to assert their space in these new platforms that provide news, information, entertainment, and just about everything else to the citizens of the world. The other thing you must learn is, I'm sorry to say, numbers. Don't be afraid of math. They say people go to journalism school because they cannot hack math. Is that true? Yeah? Yes? No? That's still the case in the US. And they say, a lot of people say the only reason I took journalism was I didn't need to get math. That's no longer something to be proud about. We need to know data, we need to know math, we need to know statistics. We have to be able to deal with large numbers, to understand what those numbers mean, and to transmit the meaning to our readers and viewers. There are so many technological changes now taking place. Changes in news gathering, even news writing. There are now machines that write the news, automated news writing. So you have to be better than the machines. They did studies that show that in sports and business stories, everyday stories, who won a basketball game, machines do it better than people. You have to be better than machines, and you have to be able to master the machines. This is also an age of experimentation and innovation. We must keep trying to see what works best. There are no formulas anymore. Even invented pyramid as a way for writing news, that formula is being questioned and being set aside. There are no formulas anymore for writing, producing, and disseminating the news. This is the age of experimentation. Experiments mean we make mistakes, but there's no shame in that. There's no shame in making mistakes. There's shame in not trying. So go out there and do your own thing. See what works best, because the way previous generations of journalists and storytellers have, for those of you in film, for example, have tried to tell their stories, no longer works, no longer attractive an audience, no longer makes money. So technological literacy is the second thing, technological literacy. The third thing you must have is specialist knowledge, domain knowledge. It is not enough to know how to write and present the news. You must also know about the subject matter of the news. So specialize in business, in economics, in anthropology, in literature, in music, architecture, science, whatever. It is important to have specialist knowledge in an era where information is ubiquitous, it's produced in massive amounts, and it's very much more complex. The reality is that this we've seen in our own journalism school at Columbia. Journalism schools cannot teach you everything. What we can teach you is that journalism requires lifelong learning. We can teach you how to learn. When things are changing so fast, we can only teach you so much, and by the time we finish teaching you, things have already changed. You have to learn on your own. Learning is an essential survival skill for journalists. Journalism schools have, I believe, journalism schools have a leading role to play at a time when our profession is being rocked by seismic changes. Journalism schools must continue to set standards of ethics and excellence in an era where the old standards are being cast aside. Journalism schools must be at the forefront of research in how citizens are using new technologies to access news and information. Journalism schools should be giving prizes to reward the best in journalistic or media practice. Journalism schools should also be reminding both journalists and citizens, both the industry, such as it is, and the viewers and readers, that news is something that is in the public interest. As there is this quote that is my favorite, and I don't know who said it. I looked it up in Wikipedia, and it's either Lord Northcliffe, who was a former editor of the Daily Mail in the UK, or William Randolph Hearst, one of the press barons in the US. One of them said, or maybe both of them said, News is something which somebody wants suppressed. All the rest is advertising. Remember this. News is something that somebody wants suppressed. All the rest is advertising. It is your job as graduates of this school to write news, to find the truth that is being suppressed and being kept away from the public, either forcibly or because it is drowned by sensationalism and fluff. As graduates of the premier journalism school in the country, it is your role to reinvent journalism in the public interest in the digital era. It is your role to revitalize the public service mission of newspapers, of journalism. The public service tradition is most deeply ingrained in newspapers, both in the Philippines and elsewhere in the world. In the Philippines, we have our own history of our national heroes writing for newspapers. The internet, Facebook, does not have that history. It is not informed. The new social platforms are not informed by a history and tradition of journalism in the public interest. Your job is to make sure that these new platforms and the new news sites that arise, that are emerging from these new technologies, hew to the mission of journalism as watchdog of society, as an agent for the public good. It is our task to speak truth to power. Facebook will not do that on its own. We need journalists like you to expose wrongdoing, especially in a country where democratic institutions are weak, where the checks on the excesses of power, the courts, opposition political parties, popular movements are currently weak. The media most often are the only check against the abuses of power. This is true not just in the Philippines, but in many other countries. There was a recent survey of businessmen worldwide. They were asked, how do you rate these institutions in terms of checking on corruption? The courts, ombudsmen, political parties, the press, the media emerged as number one. Even businessmen say, and businessmen are not always friends of journalists, even businessmen say that the most effective check on corruption and the abuse of the power is a vigilant press, vigilant journalists. We rely on you, the Golden Jubilee class of the UP College of Mass Communications, to carry on the tradition, to speak truth to power, to check on the excesses of those with money and power, and to keep the flag of the public interest reigning in whatever media platform or tool or tools for information dissemination will emerge in the years ahead. Mabuhay ang Golden Jubilee class ng UP College of Mass Communications. At maraming salamat sa inyong lahat.
Maraming salamat. Binibining ko